Welcome back, everybody. We're starting the Days of Noah number 24, and this ought to be an interesting one. We're going to start moving into the ufology and extraterrestrial movement. This is really something that's taken off over the last century. And if you recall, I believe the origin of it dates back to people like Aleister Crowley, who in 1918 he did the Amalantra working ritual where he invited Lamb, the 3-foot gray Buddhist alien, to come into our realm. And that's where the whole Lamb lore, the astral projection into the egg of spirit, going into Lamb's eyes and astral projecting through his mind and seeing other solar systems and things like this. That's where all of this began to manifest. And then we have Jack Parsons and Ron Hubbard doing sex magic rituals called the Babylon working ritual, where they're trying to incarnate the spirit of Babylon or the whore of Babylon into our plane of existence, because they felt that that would trigger the Eon of Horus. And when they did that, they received supernatural confirmation through the presence of Marjorie Cameron, a red-haired woman who was deeply into the occult and theosophy and things like this. So, it was through these occult Luciferian circles that we see the UFO movement begin. And one of the people who really helped project it and put it on the map was a man by the name of George Van Tassel. Now, this is a picture of George here in the bottom right. Now, he had a lot of interesting experience. He worked for Douglas Aircraft, Hughes Aircraft, and Lockheed Martin, which is a military defense corporation. In 1941, he left Douglas Aircraft to become Howard Hughes' personal flight inspector for testing experimental aircraft. Now, if you know anything about Howard Hughes, he was a very unusual, eccentric, recluse type of man. And Van Tassel became his personal flight inspector. He has a lot of experience with different types of aircraft. So I think that, the ufology thing was an easy move for him because of his flight experience. Now, Marjorie Cameron, after Jack Parsons passed away, Marjorie Cameron moved to San Francisco area, and she started running with different bohemian circles. One of them was this guy, George Van Tassel. And so that should give us some background information on him, because she's the one who was really steeped into the occult. She was the one who was cutting her arms and doing blood rituals to try and connect with Jack Parsons' dead spirit. She's the one who claims that she saw, UFOs and perceived that to be a spiritual manifestation of Jack. She's also the one who started running with people like Kenneth Anger, who was a very disturbed man who was producing movies called Lucifer Rising and Invocation of My Demon Brother and Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome. She starred in multiple movies, and in one movie she actually played the Scarlet Whore of Babylon, which is ironic at best, considering that Jack Parsons and Ron Hubbard felt that she was the confirmation that the Babylon working ritual was successful. She also was hanging out with guys like Anton LaVey, who wrote the Satanic Bible and was part of the Church of Satan. So, make no mistake, George Van Tassel was into all of the New Age ideology and the occult ideology. And what you'll find is that these people who dabble in this stuff, it tends to eventually lead them to the extraterrestrial movement. And the reason why is obvious. They're dabbling in the spirit realm, they're dabbling in the occult, and then later they end up stumbling on the extraterrestrials. They're naive enough to think that it's different, that these extraterrestrials aren't spiritual, but it's so obvious it's funny at this point, because every context by which they are brought about in history, the extraterrestrials that is, we always see it in a spiritual context, and today won't be any different. All of the characters that we're going to look at today were all people who are dabbling in the occult. They're doing guided meditation and transcendental meditation, and then they just coincidentally stumble into the extraterrestrials who are communicating with him telepathically. So Van Tassel and his wife and 3 daughters in 1947, which was a prominent year. That's the year that Aleister Crowley died. That's the year that Nicholas Roerich died. That's also the year that the Roswell incident had occurred. This is the year that he chose to pack up his family and move to the desert, the Mojave Desert in Giant Rock, which is in the Joshua Tree area. Now the Indians, the Native American Indians, have already recognized this as a very spiritually charged area. And Giant Rock is the largest freestanding boulder in the world. Nobody really knows, how it came to be. It's just a big, huge boulder out in the middle of nowhere. But this is a highly charged electromagnetic area where there's multiple tectonic plates and fault lines running. And so the reason that Van Tassel picked this area is the same reason that people like to go to places like Sedona, Arizona, and the Superstitious Mountains throughout that area in New Mexico, because it's a highly charged area, and we'll get into that later. But in 1953, Van Tassel started hosting weekly group guided meditations in a large underground room underneath this giant rock. And it was shortly after he started doing the group meditations that he claimed he was abducted by an extraterrestrial from Venus who telepathically downloaded into him the instructions on how to build a very interesting building known as the Integratron, which can be viewed here in the bottom right. Now it's interesting, this is the same time that guys like Kenneth Grant, who if you recall was Aleister Crowley's successor. Kenneth Grant was the man who really took over on the Lamb lore and the Lamb meditation. He is also the one who published his manifesto in 1955 announcing his discovery of an extraterrestrial civilization that was communicating with him telepathically. So 2 different guys, unrelated to each other, both of them are in the early 1950s, documenting how they are now in contact with, telepathically with extraterrestrials, and they both are theosophists, they're both into the occult, and they're both into Aleister Crowley's Thelema. Is that a coincidence? I think not. Now this structure of the Integratron is a pretty fascinating piece of architecture. It's a 4-story high, 55-foot in diameter non-metallic structure. It has 16 sides and was constructed using joinery so that there's no nuts, bolts, or screws involved and nothing that would interfere with its conductive properties. The inside of the device has been determined to be acoustically sound and has 16 small windows to allow you to overlook the Mojave Desert. So here's an image of the room that was built underneath this giant rock. And this is where multiple people in the New Age movement and the occult would come on a weekly basis, and they would do transcendental guided meditation. And then very shortly afterwards, they made contact, George Van Tassel made contact with the extraterrestrials. And you may say, well, how is that possible? And it's really no different than me driving down the road with my truck. Maybe I'm out in the country, and I'm whipping through the radio dial, and I'm not able to pick up any signals from any radio stations. But as I start coming into the town, all of a sudden I pick up on a radio, on a frequency or a wavelength that's coming through, and the music starts coming through, and I go, oh, okay, there it is. There's the music. You turn it up and you listen to it. Same thing. If you recall Lamb, the 3-foot gray alien that Crowley led into our world, Kenneth Grant said that he's beaming occult vibrations and frequencies down onto the planet to bring in and manifest the Eon of Horus. And so when these people start doing guided meditation and they're opening themselves up and they're trying to receive these vibrations and frequencies, then finally, they become in tune, just like the radio dial. They finally get into that right frequency and they become in tune. And now these spiritual extraterrestrial entities that are traveling around the spirit realm, all of a sudden they realize, hey, we got another one right here. We can pick up on the frequency and vibration of this one down here. Here's another person who's looking for this, and so they can go and make contact. And so it sounds like a strange situation, but that's exactly what's happening. So Van Tassel's UFO contact led to the formation of a metaphysics research lab in 1958 known as the Ministry of Universal Wisdom. He started this to document all the spiritual revelations that he was regularly receiving via telepathic communications with entities from space, actually entities from a higher dimension called demons and angels. The ministry claimed that extraterrestrials had telepathically given him the plans to build the Integratron. They called the Integratron a time machine for basic research on rejuvenation, anti-gravity, and time travel. Van Tassel wrote about his research in multiple books that he published. From 53 to 78, he hosted the Giant Rock Spacecraft Convention besides Giant Rock, which attracted at its peak in 1959 as many as 11,000 attendees. So most people don't realize that for about 15 years, California became the UFO leader of the world. People were traveling from all around the world and all around the United States and coming out to Giant Rock spacecraft conventions. And here are some of the black and white photos that you can see of that era that was advertising this. You had 11,000 New Agers coming out there to this area. It's a highly charged area, and they're swapping stories about UFOs and giving their different understandings on what's going on, who they're telepathically communicating with. It was so prominent that they actually made it into Life magazine in 1957 with the article called "Believers Hold Meeting in Desert to Swap Interplanetary Tall Tales." So here's an image of the Integratron today, and up here on the top left, it almost has the appearance of like a giant eye when you're looking at it from space or from the atmosphere, right up here. And then I can't help but look at this and kind of see a big white round egg. It kind of reminds me of the egg of spirit, how Kenneth Grant says that if you do the mantra and you stare at Lamb, you'll travel into the eyes of Lamb, and then you'll begin to astral project into the egg of spirit. But also it resembles a UFO. If you look at the architecture, it really has a close resemblance to a UFO. In fact, when you look at it, it has that dome shape to it. I mean, how many buildings do you see shaped like that? And then you see this circular thing going around right here. That's a very similar thing that you see on almost all spacecraft. They have a dome, just like this one here, and then they have that circular lip that goes all the way around circumferentially. And considering that this came from extraterrestrials, or at least that's what they claim to be, I'm submitting that they're fallen angels and they're of the demonic hierarchy underneath Satan. And they downloaded this information into Van Tassel's brain, which we already reviewed that people who are into Eastern mysticism, people who do guided meditation and transcendental meditation, they awaken the Kundalini spirit, which travels up the spine, the coiled serpent. It goes to the different 7 chakras until it reaches the crown chakra of the brain, and then they have the Kundalini awakening. That's where they're now finally in touch with the spirit realm. And this allows the entities to flow into them. They gain access through the person through the central nervous system. And then one of the principal things about the Kundalini awakening, beyond all of the supernatural spiritual phenomenon that they experience, is that they have these consistent downloads from the spirit realm where they're receiving intelligence from a higher level. And so here is a perfect example of a person who received supernatural intelligence from the spirit realm, and now we're getting a glimpse of it. Emily Canning from Golden State Productions, who is a widely known New Ager, she's been offering multiple seminars at the Integratron in the past. Some of them are on concepts such as planetary healings. See, the New Agers are into Mother Earth, Mother Gaia, as they refer to her, and they believe that she's a living organism and that she cleanses herself. And she's discussing things like planetary healings. She'll do readings from George Van Tassel's books, also a UFO watch, and then psychic development sessions so that you can telepathically communicate with the extraterrestrials. And this is what she had to say about the Integratron. She says it's a very powerful vortex for both physical and spiritual healing. Now, a vortex is like a circular area of energy that leads to a higher dimension. And she's claiming now that not only do you receive physical healing, but you receive spiritual healing. Kind of like the Reiki practitioners that we looked at several lectures ago, who are tapping into the universal energy known as chi or prana. And as they do transcendental meditation over you, they're then able to lay their hands on you, and the chi flows from them into you, and it brings both emotional, mental, and physical well-being to your body. So this is the same kind of New Age ideology that she's discussing, only it's now this machine that's doing it instead of a person. She says that it combines sacred geometry with electromagnetics, sonics, future science, and ancient wisdom. So that's quite a statement right there. You know, sacred geometry comes up time and time again when you get into the occult, because you find out that sacred geometry is necessary in order to harness enough power to open up higher dimensions to the spirit realm. So Luciferians and occultists and Satanists who dabble in witchcraft and sorcery, they always use sacred geometry like triangles and circles and pentagrams and hexagrams and other things like that. So I think that that's an interesting connection. I believe that the reason we're seeing sacred geometry using here is because ultimately this is just a new age high-tech form of divination and witchcraft, but it also involves electromagnetics. Now, I think the previous lectures have demonstrated that electromagnetism is a highly important thing when dealing with the spirit realm. This is why the New Agers are so invested in altering their electromagnetic frequencies. Everything is about vibration and frequencies to these guys. You know, it's not a coincidence that the Beach Boys sang a song called Good Vibrations. And when you look at that song, it has to do with putting off good vibes. See, it's all about the vibration and the frequency of the earth, and all about the vibration and the frequency of the universe, and it's all about the vibration and frequency of each cell in your body. And that's why Nikola Tesla over here said, if you want to understand the universe, you need to think of energy, frequency, and vibration. So this Integratron is blending the sacred geometry along with electromagnetism, and we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of that here in a moment. But then also it involves sonics, future science, and ancient wisdom. The reason she includes ancient wisdom is because when you go back and you look at all of the mystery schools and all of the secret societies, they all form around this concept of the as above, so below hermeticism, where what happens in the spirit realm controls things in the physical realm. And essentially this Integratron allows a person to connect with the spirit realm in a more powerful way. The Integratron is a functional high-voltage electrostatic generator, drawing inspiration from multiple sources including Nikola Tesla and the Book of Exodus. This 21st century version of Moses' tabernacle is constructed entirely of wood and fiberglass without the use of nails or screws. As we get into the lecture, you're going to find out that George Van Tassel was the one who came up with this concept that Jesus was really an alien, that Mary was really an alien, that all of the angels were really, truly extraterrestrials, and there's this whole Christian revisionist theory that revises the Bible to remove all the spirituality of it and replace it with extraterrestrials and aliens. And so Van Tassel believed that the Old Testament tabernacle where God's Spirit would come and reside, where you had the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy of Holies, he believed that that was really more or less extraterrestrial technology, and that this Integratron is a 21st century version of that. And as we get into the shape of the Integratron, we're going to see that it's actually based on the shape of UFOs with the dome and the lip that runs around the edge. So this Integratron supposedly provides useful connection between electrical energy and spirituality. The Integratron has much in common with New Age products such as energy pyramids and orgone accumulators. I want you to notice how the New Agers are making the connection. They're the ones who are saying that there's a connection between electrical energy and spiritual energy. And we're going to see that a lot today when we get into the ley lines and the electromagnetic lines of the earth. But think back over some of the lectures. I mean, we saw this with the age of electronica music, with the theosophists like Alexander Scriabin, who, channeled all of his music and all of the inspiration for electronic music. We saw the connection between electrical energy and spirituality. We also saw the connection between organizations such as Scientology, which is a UFO religion, where in order to become part of that group, you have to go through a clearing process where you go through a ritual holding an electropsychometer. And they talk about being able to measure the psyche or the mental energy that's being passed into a person. Same thing with the Process Church, which we know was instrumental in starting off the Manson family and the Son of Sam killer and many other groups. It was a satanic church. Jim Jones was associated with that. And so, I agree with them here when they say that there is a connection between the electrical energy and the spirituality. The problem with the New Agers is they're confused about what the spirituality is. They think it's all these benevolent spirits and all of these, good energies and these ascended masters of the brotherhood who are reincarnated spirits who are here to help. They don't realize that it's Satan and all the principalities and powers and spiritual demonic entities of the spiritual realm. Now, we are going to get into some of the New Age products at a later time, such as the energy pyramids and the orgone accumulators. For now, I included a copy over here of an orgone accumulator. You can see this is a pyramid-shaped New Age orgone accumulator, and it has the downward triangle, so you can see the pyramid facing up is the as above, and here's the pyramid facing down, which is one of the chakras. So as above, so below, and that's the union or the yoking of the physical with the spiritual. So, as we're gonna see, George Van Tassel believed that every time you went into the Integratron, it charged your body's cells and rejuvenated you and brought healing to you. It didn't keep him alive all that long. He ended up dying in 1978 before he even completed the Integratron. But he's remembered today as a key figure of the UFO contactee movement and an early wave of self-identified UFO abductees who promoted various utopian philosophies. The ownership of the Integratron changed hands several times throughout the 80s and the 90s, but the building has been consistently maintained. And now today it's privately owned, and it's even used for what's called sonic sound baths, where you can go in there and receive a sonic bath. It's an acoustically perfect wooden dome that helps rejuvenate your cells, and we'll get into that more in a moment. But it's always rented out to the New Age occultists for different spiritual retreats. So here's the inside. You can see how it's designed. It's got a pretty slick architecture here with all these windows, and we see the Oculus dome at the top, the way all the wood and everything is curved to make a dome. On the inside, you see all of these crystal bowls that help resonate the frequencies, and then people come in and they lay on these mats and they listen to New Age music, and they do transcendental meditation, and they play, they have energy that's traveling through this building, electromagnetic energy that's traveling through the crystals in the building, and they claim that it's supposed to bring both spiritual and physical healing. So according to Van Tassel, the Integratron's workings rely on the generation of strong intermittent magnetic fields. The Integratron is based on a high voltage Tesla coil and a split ring resonator that generates ultra wideband electromagnetic frequencies. Van Tassel claimed that electromagnetism affects biological cells, and he believed that every biological cell has a unique resonant electromagnetic frequency called EMF. And the generation of strong ultra-wideband EMFs by the Integratron will resonate into the human body within the cell's frequency and structure. He claims that all of these, this is what brings healing to the person's cells, rejuvenation as they refer to it. You can go in there and do a 60-minute sonic healing sound bath, which consists of crystal bowls played in the sound chamber to recorded music in which there's perfect acoustics. So this is pretty heavy New Age stuff right here. We're talking about, we're talking about the fallen angels, just like before in the book of Enoch. If you go back and you look at the first 6 lectures, we know that the fallen angels came down from the higher realms. They manifested here on this planet. For all we know, they showed up in spacecraft, for all we know. We don't know how they showed up. We know that all of the ancient archaeological records and all of the ancient civilizations referred to as the star people, who came down, in little craft and came down from the higher space realms and then mated with the women and made all the hybrids. And we see that very consistently. Now we're seeing that, these entities are giving these downloads to build things like the Integratron. Now, if you recall in the book of Enoch, it says that the fallen angels were revealing things from heaven to mankind, things that they never should have known. And so it makes you wonder, this just didn't come out of somebody's imagination. Van Tassel claims that he was receiving these supernatural downloads through guided meditation. And then he built this sophisticated structure, which is based on intermittent magnetic fields and a Tesla coil with a split ring resonator. It's a very complicated structure. And so, these entities obviously communicated this to Van Tassel for a reason. It reminds me a lot of what Kenneth Grant said. Lam is the transmitter and the occult energy which is beaming vibrations and frequencies in order to manifest the Eon of Horus. So this is one of the fulfillments of the Eon of Horus through Aleister Crowley's writings. Van Tassel, this comes from author Kim Stringfellow. She quotes that Van Tassel recounted his first encounter with the aliens in his 1956 book, Into This World and Out Again. He was awakened by Salganda, a member of the Council of the Seven Lights, around 2 a.m. in August of 1953, and he was taken onto a spacecraft that had landed at Giant Rock's adjacent airstrip. Van Tassel described being teleported aboard the spacecraft, and Salganda and 3 other male humanoid aliens showed him the craft's celestial navigational instrumentation and other features, all communicated to Van Tassel via telepathy. The entire incident was estimated to have lasted 20 minutes. During a 1964 televised interview, Van Tassel described the extraterrestrials as youthful, white people with good healthy tan and on average human height. He estimated that their ages are 700 years old. Adamski also claimed that the Venusians subscribed to the universal law, stressing a creator to all that conveniently reflected the Judeo-Christian religious beliefs and doctrines. The idea that Christianity and even Christ himself came from outer space seems to be the prevailing ethos communicated by these alien mentors to their 1950s contactees. Van Tassel went so far as to postulate that Mary, the mother of Christ, was an extraterrestrial who volunteered through assignment to birth Jesus on Earth, or Shan, as the space people were said to call our planet. It seems like Jesus Christ, too, was an alien selected for duty. Both were part of Van Tassel's Adamic race of space people of God's pure creation. He goes on to mention that the 3 wise men present at Christ's birth were extraterrestrials who followed the spacecraft, better known as the Star of Bethlehem, until it hovered where Jesus was being born. This is just one of Van Tassel's numerous and complicated revisionist interpretations of both the New and Old Testaments, in which he posits that angels are just a misspelling and misinterpretation for aliens, or that a select group of individuals with a correct vibratory body aura will be snatched up to the heavens by godly extraterrestrials during the rapture. So we're going to get into some pretty wild ideology about how the rapture is going to be the extraterrestrials who are going to come down and take us all up into their ships, and that we'll all vanish at once. And this is really going to happen, people. There's going to be a false rapture with extraterrestrials, so pay attention. In 1976 collection of writings, When Stars Look Down, whether one believes in Christ or not is not the point. The point is that the conditions of Earth require outside intervention, and that the time conforms to the requirements of prophecy. Van Tassel, along with the other 1950s Christian ufologists, including Adamski and Angelucci, would help usher in the 1970s New Age of Earth movement that brought together esoteric traditions, occultism, the 1960s counterculture, and environmentalism in an eclectic, holistic spiritual institution. So we've talked about a lot of the different things that brought in the New Age movement in the past. You know, all the sex, drug, and the rock and roll, and the music, and the movie industry, and Hollywood, and Crowley. Well, this was another facet to it. You know, the 1950s was the age of the UFO era, and it helped birth in this New Age movement. And it's a blending of the occult, it's a blending of the New Age, it's a blending of Eastern mysticism. It's the same supernatural spirit working through all of these people. If you recall, this really all got started back with Crowley, 1918. He did the Amalantra working ritual where him and Roddy Minor brought in a 3-foot gray alien in his apartment in New York City. He says it actually manifested in real life where you could touch it and see it. Then later, Jack Parsons and Ron Hubbard did the Babylon working ritual, and they said that was just an extension of the Amalantra working ritual. They used the same things that Crowley did. It was based on his teachings, only they added a little bit of their own spice. And later Crowley said that they opened up the doorway that Crowley had opened to let Lamb in, that these guys had enlarged that doorway, that they had enlarged that tear in the fabric of space-time to the higher dimensions so that more entities could be coming in. And in fact, they didn't know how to close it. And so now the tear was widening and enlarging, and no one ever closed it. And it's right away. That was in 1946. And then 1947, boom, we have the Roswell Incident. We have the guy in Mount Rainier who sees all the spacecraft. And then all of a sudden in the 50s, you have the birth of the UFO movement. And so make no mistake, this is off the heels of Satanism, Luciferianism, and occultism by Aleister Crowley and his followers of Thelema. They're the ones who were nuclear physicists working for NASA and Jet Propulsion's laboratory. They're the ones who were smart enough and who understood quantum physics and were able to shatter the boundaries of space and time. That's what they claimed the Babylon working ritual was meant to do in 1946. And so they're the ones who open up these higher dimensions and let these extraterrestrial entities in. And like Kenneth Grant already said, you know, the age of Horus, the spiritual age of Horus, was symbolized by the UFO occupants as extraterrestrials. So, you know, we're now getting to see the fruit of all that. And we're getting to see this ideology of how all of Christianity really has to do with these extraterrestrials. And so it's going to be quite an interesting deception ahead. Now I want you to think about the timing of all this. We've went through the previous lectures and we've showed that there were a lot of different forces that were working to bring in the 60s counterculture. We saw that Hinduism and Eastern mysticism was part of it. We saw that the supernatural spirit was working through the music and through the movie industry. We saw some of the UFO religions like Scientology was part of it. So the serial killer era. There were all these different factors and influences that were being woven together to make the perfect storm so that they could lead people away from biblical Christian values and start preparing them for this New Age ideology. And a big part of it was this UFO era that really started in the late 40s and had its breakout moment in the 50s and then began to shape and mold and lead to some of the 1960s counterculture and environmentalism that we begin to see at that point in time. Now we have to appreciate that this structure came from George Van Tassel's mind after he claims he was taken aboard a spacecraft by the extraterrestrials from Venus. He says that they showed him all of their navigational systems and the technology. And so then they downloaded that telepathically into his brain. And over the next 20 years, he recreated what he witnessed. And so this thing is essentially a UFO, if you will, only it's not moving, of course. It's stationary on the ground. But they claim it's for time travel, and it has anti-gravity properties. And so the way that it's worked for time travel is that when people open up a higher dimension and they go into the spirit realm and they astral project out of their body, they're in a different place. There is no time as we understand it in the spirit realm. And so from that perspective, it offers time travel. It's not like you come into this thing and you go back 1,000 years and get to see the Dark Ages, or you can fast forward 500 years and go through time travel in that regard. But it's a nuance of time travel in that you're leaving our four-space time dimension, which is based on length, height, width, and time. And so when you go up into the fifth and sixth dimension, you're no longer under the effects of linear time. So from that angle, it is a time machine. Now the UFO anti-gravity, the same time that Van Tassel's doing all this, we're going to find later that the Nazis were also receiving intelligence from the fallen angels. They were doing seances. They were deeply into the occult. They had a bunch of high-level spiritists and mediums and savants who were doing rituals. They were trying to receive as much higher knowledge from spirit beings as possible. They were constructing a UFO called the Nazi Bell and using technology that they had received from these higher realms to create anti-gravity technology. And so, this is on the other side of the planet. The same time that these things are happening over in Germany, the same things are happening over here in California. So you see the same supernatural sophisticated spirit that's working through various groups and various people to bring about the UFO technology that would kick off the whole UFO era. And if you look closely, you see the concentric circles within concentric circles. I've said in the past, as demonstrated over here on the right, look at the Twilight Zone here. That movie was always about metaphysical and paranormal activities. So anytime you see these circles within circles heading towards a little black, area here, that's where you're getting ready to go into a higher dimension. Same thing here with chasing the rabbit down the rabbit hole, or as the bottom picture here shows, the hidden portals. If you look here, you'll see there's concentric circles within concentric circles within concentric circles, and at the top it all coalesces here. That's why that woman said that it was a vortex of metaphysical energy. This thing does allow you to astral project and leave your body and undergo a spiritual manifestation on a higher level. Now let's compare that to the cult of Lamb, which was also taking place around this timeline. If you recall, people would look at a portrait of Lamb, the 3-foot gray alien over here. They would stare at him, and the visual focus is called the yantra of the cult. This is Eastern mysticism. Then they would recite his name, which is the mantra. And when you do the two long enough, you form the tantra, which is the union of spirit and flesh. Now, in this specific instance, they say that the tantra is the union in which the person enters the egg of spirit through the head. That means you're actually entering into Lamb's eyes and you're going into this big head right here. Now, the people who experienced this claimed that it was a very close parallel with alien abduction syndromes that people who had been abducted by aliens would describe. Now think about that for a second. And you can see the similarities between the egg of spirit and of the Integratron. Kenneth Grant had said that the cult of Lamb has been founded through an extraterrestrial and transplutonic energy required to communicate at this critical period in history, for we've now entered the 80s mentioned in the Book of the Law. It is our aim to obtain insight in the nature of Lamb and into the possibility of using the egg as an astral space capsule for traveling to Lamb's domain and for exploring extraterrestrial space. So Kenneth Grant recognized that this head right here was something that could possibly be used as an astral space capsule for exploring extraterrestrial space. That means exploring the spirit realm. They're talking about the astral space, not our space within our own four-dimensional time space, but they're talking about the 5th, 6th, 7th, and higher dimensions. And the reason I bring that up is because we're learning that that's exactly what we're dealing with here with the Integratron. When you go inside of this Integratron, it's in a supercharged area on the planet that has a lot of high electromagnetic frequencies along the ley lines, which we'll discuss in a moment. The building has been created with a Tesla coil and a resonator so that it helps magnify that electromagnetism. They're using charged music, crystals, and doing transcendental meditation on the inside. When you combine all these things, it's allowing the person to have a supernatural experience on a level like entering Lamb's head. And so, in essence, I kind of view it as, imagine if you were astral projecting and you entered into the eye right here of Lamb, and you were now inside this head of his. What would that look like on the inside? And if you could draw a schematic of this head on a technological level, it would be this right here. This is the situation that will allow you to use an astral space capsule to explore Lamb's domain. I mean, we got to put things into context. It's not a coincidence that Kenneth Grant, who came up with the cult of Lamb, was a follower of Crowley, and it's not a coincidence that Van Tassel was close friends with Marjorie Cameron and a follower of Crowley. You say, well, what's the purpose of all this? Well, Kenneth Grant explains it. This transplutonic energy along these electromagnetic fields that the New Agers are into, it is to communicate this critical period of history mentioned in the Book of the Law. See, the Book of the Law was the book that said that we were going to enter into a new age or a new eon of Horus, the light bearer, and it would be an age where we would leave biblical principles and follow Lucifer. And it was also coming from a man who, named himself Master Therion and believed that he was the fulfillment of the Book of Revelations. And he was obsessed with bringing about the Antichrist to help usher in the eon of Horus. So you can see that it really is all of a spiritual and satanic phenomenon. Of course, if you ask any of the New Agers that, they would say no to all that because they don't believe in the Bible, they don't believe in the Scripture, they don't believe in Satan, they don't believe in any of that. They're into the New Age stuff, they're into the extraterrestrials. Now, Van Tassel was the very first person to ever claim to have contact with Ashtar, one of the most prominent names in the UFO field today. Today, there are thousands of people around the world who still claim to be in contact with Ashtar. The Ashtar movement has taken off so much and is so prominent today that academics study it as a form of UFO religion. Van Tassel claimed that his very first contact with Ashtar took place in 1952. George went on to claim that Jesus was actually a being from space and that everyone has the ability to tap into the universal mind of God. That's called the Christ consciousness that we discussed earlier when we were getting into Eastern mysticism. See, over there in Tibet, they're claiming to be in contact with these ascended masters who are of this universal wisdom, these great brotherhood, they call it the Great White Brotherhood of Ascended Masters. And these ascended masters are trying to teach mankind how to evolve into the Christ consciousness. And they refer to Jesus as one of the ascended masters. So this is kind of a spin-off of this. So George Van Tassel is claiming that Jesus is really one of these extraterrestrial beings who had the ability to tap into the universal mind of God, also known as the Christ consciousness, in order to establish such communication, which he claims facilitates evolutionary progress, such as that exemplified by Ashtar and Jesus. In other words, mankind is evolving. We're going to get into the theory of evolution here in a couple chapters. We're going to tie evolution into all this stuff because they subscribe to this notion of evolution. And now it's time for mankind to enter into the age of Aquarius and evolve to this higher spiritual level. If you remember guys like Alexander Scriabin, who wanted to invent the Mysterium, which was a huge, ritual that was going to take place for 1 week in the Himalayan mountains, which was supposed to open up all the 5 senses and bring in this higher dimension where we would all evolve to a higher dimension. all of the New Age ideologies based on this New Age evolutionary process. According to Van Tassel, Ashtar had entered the solar system in order to warn humanity against detonating the hydrogen bomb. Now I find this really interesting because around the same time that Van Tassel is communicating with this so-called extraterrestrial named Ashtar, who seems to be worried about mankind getting the hydrogen bomb and using it like we did in World War II, we have Ron Hubbard, who in the same timeline is also dealing with Xenu. If you recall, Scientology is another UFO religion, and he was making contact. He talks about Xenu, who's of the Galactic Confederacy, which consists of 76 planets and 26 stars, including Earth, who 75 million years ago supposedly brought billions of people to the Earth in advanced spacecraft. And then, if you recall, Xenu, when he got overpopulated, he brought all those people to Earth and packed them into a volcano and detonated it and blew them up with hydrogen bombs. So, this begs the question, does this extraterrestrial entity over here on the right named Ashtar, who's, out there in the solar system, does he happen to know Xenu, the Scientology extraterrestrial who's part of the Galactic Confederacy? Surely all of these intergalactic beings must know each other. And so Ashtar allegedly claimed that they would not allow humans to destroy Earth through the use of nuclear power, and that their galactic command was here to assist the human race in the evolutionary development. And this is an image of him over here on the right, and you can see some of the symbolism. We see that this is looks like a coil, an electric coil, like electromagnetism. Here we see the six-pointed star, the as above, so below, which we see often in witchcraft and sorcery. Same thing down here in the bottom right. This is another picture of Ashtar. He's got a, sacred geometry. He's got the star on his hand. He's got the six-pointed star on his shirt. And so this is the guy that Van Tassel was making contact with. And he's supposedly the one who's making claims now that Jesus is really an extraterrestrial, and that, these extraterrestrials want to save us from, World War III and killing ourselves, and they want to save us from the apocalypse and help us evolve to the next level. George claimed that the Integratron worked by generating strong intermittent magnetic fields which caused a coronal discharge and negative air ionization as a result of plasma generation. So you can see it's pretty complicated technology that came from the higher dimensions. The Integratron is also largely based on the multi-wave oscillator as originally designed by George Lakowski. Each living cell in our bodies function much like a tuned circuit, with its DNA strand acting as a self-inducting coil. Each living cell is capable of resonating to an external source of frequencies in the same manner as a guitar string beginning to vibrate when exposed to the standard pitch of a correct tuning fork. So we've talked about this a lot over the chapters before. Human beings are nothing but a big electromagnetic receiver, and depending on what you're dabbling around in, your cells in your body, like it says right here, they are a tuned circuit with a DNA strand acting as a self-inducting coil. So everything you're doing is adjusting your DNA and your self-inducting coil to make contact. So this is how it works. These guys deny Christianity. They deny Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit. They're not born again. They don't have the Holy Spirit. Then they begin to dabble in Eastern mysticism. They begin to dabble into the occult. This always leads to New Age ideology. As they're dabbling in all these things and doing guided meditation, this opens them up to the frequency and vibrations that are being beamed from the demonic realm. As they receive these frequencies and vibrations, that begins to adjust their DNA and their cellular electromagnetic frequency so that it's in line and in tune with the extraterrestrial, alien, demonic manifestations. And then it's after they've done all this stuff that then they begin to telepathically communicate with the, quote, extraterrestrials, which are clearly spiritual in origin. So it's a pretty sophisticated system, but this is what it is. I wish somebody could explain to me why we continue to see this six-pointed star everywhere. I mean, we know it's a hexagram. We know when you study witchcraft and sorcery that they use it to put a hex on people. Aleister Crowley was obsessed with the pentagram and the hexagram. You can see him down here. He's wearing a hat. It's got a pyramid-shaped hat with the eye of Horus, which is the all-seeing eye that's on our dollar bill. And we've already, if you look above that, I've already drawn it out. It's a six-pointed star. There's these rays of illumination. This is the Gnostics, the ones who've been enlightened. The Illuminati goes all the way back to the garden. So, you know, he's into the secret societies and the mystery schools, and he's claiming to have all this knowledge, and he's got the six-pointed star on his head. And then over here, we know that the Masons are the ones who put it on the dollar. I mean, here's their symbol right here. It's a six-pointed star. I put the horizontal lines in there to fulfill the compass and the square. And then you move over to the right, and we see that if you draw an upside-down pyramid on top of the Great Seal, it spells out M-A-S-O-N. It's an anagram for Masons. So we know that the Freemasons, they were part of the mystery schools that understand the secret knowledge. If you look over here on the top right, you've got this little guy sitting like Buddha. He's doing transcendental meditation, and that's how you take the macrocosm and form it with a microcosm, or the union of the spiritual realm, the heavenly realm, with the earthly realm. So the Eastern mystics are familiar with this secret knowledge. You know, the Church of Satan uses Baphomet. He's pointing up to the light-sided moon and pointing down to the dark-sided moon, and he represents the as above, so below. That's the same thing as the upside-down triangle on the right-side-up triangle. So the Satanists and the Luciferians are part of the secret society, and they understand the secret knowledge. And now over here we see the extraterrestrial entities who've got their six-pointed stars all over the place. You know, as above, so below. What happens in the heavenly realm is what controls things here on the earthly realm. And what you're going to find is that it's all connected. We're gonna spend a lot of time in the next lecture explaining who Ashtar Command is. They're claiming to be Jesus. They're claiming to say that Jesus and everything that happened in the Bible has to do with extraterrestrials and aliens. And they're talking about this process called the Ascension, which is a fake rapture that's going to happen down the road. And essentially, they're claiming that all of the mystery schools and the secret societies have all been from them, that they have been downloading knowledge to these secret societies for thousands of years, preparing mankind for the final spiritual evolution known as the Ascension. And we're going to tie all this in together. But let's just not forget that this star is a perfect geometric and mathematical representation of a 666. Let's also not forget that that's the same symbol that flies over the land of Israel right now, which is God's holy land in Jerusalem. Don't you find that a little bit ironic? And we'll get into that later in later chapters. Kim Stringfellow goes on to say that sprinkled throughout Van Tassel's essays are references to esoteric philosophies, including theosophy and spiritualism, along with hints of Scientology, Mormonism, and his own Christian revisionist ufology. So you can see all these different influences. Esoteric philosophies means all of the mystery schools of the past, the as above, so below type of philosophies. Theosophy, of course, is Madame Blavatsky, who brought, Eastern mysticism into the West, and she had a big impact on Adolf Hitler, and he began to believe in that what she ascribed to as the 6 root races, and that the Aryan race were the most supreme race. And so theosophy is a very unusual metaphysical religion, if you will. We've already discussed Scientology, that it's essentially a UFO religion, that they subscribe to the idea that this intergalactic being named Xenu came to Earth, millions of years ago, and murdered a bunch of his own citizens by sticking them into volcanoes and blowing them up with hydrogen bombs. I mean, what kind of religion is that? Has that at its root core? And that all of those people that were destroyed released their Thetan souls, and now those Thetan souls are attached to me and you and everybody else and infecting us. And those Thetan souls helped make up religions like Christianity. So it's a really wild UFO cult. If you really get to the bottom of Mormonism and you study it deeply enough, it ends up going into a similar fashion, that when they die, they inherit their own solar system and become their own gods of their own worlds and their own planets, and it has some UFO connotations. So basically, Van Tassel just did the buffet style religion where he took a little bits and pieces of everything, smacked it together, and kind of made his own mystical, philosophical religion, if you will. Over time, he would boast that he appeared on 409 radio and television shows and had given 297 lectures. For those of us who weren't around in the 50s, we don't appreciate just how prominent this was. I mean, all of California was into this at this time. This is right before the 1960s shift. We've already studied how the 60s, how the values, the biblical values were changing so radically in the 60s. Well, now you see that the decade before, you have thousands of people, lots of New Agers and occultists who are traveling out to the desert and doing all of these UFO conventions. It kind of reminds me of Burning Man today in the Nevada desert, where this group of people come and do, interesting things. But Van Tassel didn't just stop there. He was on the radio programs. Back then in the 50s, to be on the radio was a very prominent thing. Television wasn't that popularized. It's not like everybody sat around and watched TV all day like they do today. So to be on 409 radio stations, to be on television programs, to give 297 lectures about this, you really see that this is kind of the major birth of the UFO era. And listening and watching the few archived lectures available online, it's easy to comprehend why his followers found his demeanor so convincing, because Van Tassel had a very reassuring voice, and his fair, conservative Anglo appearance projected an effortless image of professionalism, sincerity, and authority. He's got the entities working in him. Adolf Hitler did the same thing. So did Jim Jones. Jim Jones convinced 904 people to drink cyanide. Adolf Hitler convinced a whole nation to, murder people and throw their bodies in incinerators. So what you find is that these people who dabble in this stuff, when they let these entities in, some of these entities are very smooth and sophisticated, these familiar seducing spirits, and they begin to work through these men, and they give them the spirit of divination, they give them the spirit of mesmerism, and these guys become spellbinders. They're able to just put a spell on people and hypnotically convince them of things, and for those who aren't walking in the truth with the Holy Spirit, they fall for it hook, line, and sinker. So this is Van Tassel on the right. Now, another interesting fellow who was part of this whole 1950s UFO situation is a guy by the name of Truman Bethurum. And actually, this is Truman on the right. Sorry, that's not Van Tassel. So Truman Bethurum, he also made contact with aliens in the Mojave Desert. And interestingly enough, by day, he was just a regular, construction laborer. But by night, he moonlighted as a fortune teller and spiritual advisor. So that should tell you something right there. A fortune teller means that they're basically a medium and a spiritist. They're trying to communicate with entities outside of their body, and they're also allowing entities to come into their body, which means that they're demonized. We already talked about, what happens with these entities. The scripture says that they cannot find rest until they get into a human host body. So once you let them in, they don't leave unless they're kicked out against their will. So this guy, he's allowed this to come into his life. And so is it any coincidence that then, of course, after he does that, he makes contact with the extraterrestrials? So Bethurum detailed his own experience in 1954 book called Aboard a Flying Saucer, claiming he had been invited aboard a spacecraft that landed in the desert near his workplace. The captain of the vessel was a petite, attractive humanoid female named Aura Raines, who was visiting from the planet Clarion. That's an interesting name, Aura Raines. An aura is what the New Agers claim that, some people have around them. It's this electricity that goes around a person. Whenever we see all these images of the ascended masters and different, guided, different enlightened people, they'll have this little white sunburst effect around their body. We refer to that as an aura. Also, this is what people who have epilepsy experience. They experience an aura before they have, a central nervous system episode. So, I find that's an unusual name. So Aura Reigns, who was visiting from the planet Clarion. And this is a picture of her on the bottom right that he sketched. Betharam explained how this unknown planet Clarion could not be directly viewed by humans because it remained behind the sun. How convenient. During their 10 recorded meetings, notably at public lunch counters, Aura stated that Clarion was a utopian society free of war, divorce, and taxes. She went on to share how Clarionites lived to be nearly 1,000 years old and were good Christians. Betharam became obsessed with Aura throughout his life, and actually his obsession with this woman led to the breakdown of his second marriage. But he ended up getting married a third time at Giant Rock. So he became buddies with Van Tassel. They teamed up, and they started doing these Giant Rock interplanetary spacecraft conventions in the 50s and 60s. The events attracted droves of UFO-obsessed people who had spent 2 days in the desert camping in tents. The core 1950s contactees included Van Tassel, Betharam, and a guy named Adamski, which we'll look at next. And they lectured to a festive and enthusiastic crowd from a wooden platform at Giant Rock. In the evening, attendees gathered around campfires swapping personal sightings of UFOs, alien abductions, and other unexplained phenomenon. So this was the third member of the trio. You had Van Tassel, Betharam, and then you had this guy, George Adamski. He was a famous 1950s contactee along with Van Tassel. He published 3 books. Notice all 3 of these guys published multiple books. You know, they didn't take them long, and I'll tell you why. You say, well, oh, isn't that a coincidence? They all just happen to be enthusiastic and be authors. No, that's not it. They've got entities working through them, and the goal of this supernatural spirit is to get this information disseminated as far and wide as it can. That's why guys like Ron Hubbard, you know, went after Hollywood and after the movie makers. And so, you know, they're being inspired to make these books. It's not their own natural revelation. It's not their own natural intelligence. They're receiving supernatural revelation from demonic entities who are inspiring them to write books. And by the way, these books, some of these books are becoming bestsellers. So one of his books was about the Nordics. And this is really the first time that we see the Nordics come on the scene, is in the 50s. Prior to that, it was the gray aliens, you know, the little 3-foot grays, and then become the Nordics, the tall, white Nordics, who, as we're going to study, end up being the same entities as the ascended masters from the Tibetan area. So, you know, over in Tibet and Eastern mysticism, they're making contact with the Great Brotherhood of ascended masters, who are these tall, white, beautiful entities who are glowing, you know, have auras around them, who've been able to go into the 5th, 6th, and 7th initiations and into the 5th and 6th and 7th dimensions. Well, now over here in the States, these ascended masters essentially become these extraterrestrial entities called the Nordics. So here we go with this guy, George Adamski. In the 1920s, he became involved with the occult and joined Theosophy. So he was in Theosophy for 30 years before he had a UFO experience. By 1930, he was a prominent figure in the California occult scene, teaching a mixture of Christianity and Eastern religions. Also in the 1930s, he founded the Royal Order of Tibet, which was a temple of scientific philosophy. So you kind of see the same thing with these guys. You know, they're all just like Crowley. You know, Crowley never got into the occult until he was in his 20s, and he went into India and got a guru and traveled through Tibet, learned how to do transcendental meditation. Same thing with this guy Adamski. Once you expose yourself to the Eastern religions, that's how you become demonized. And then, you know, again, he was inspired to found this organization called the Royal Order of Tibet, which is basically a contemporary of Van Tassel's organization, the Mystery of the Universal Wisdom. In November 20th, 1952, Adamski describes making contact in the California desert with a Venusian humanoid with long brown hair and tan skin by the name of Orthon. So all 3 of these guys made contact with these extraterrestrial beings. All 3 of them, it happened in the desert where there was no one around, where it's a highly charged area where some of the ley lines are. We're going to get into what the ley lines are in a minute. It's a highly electromagnetic area. and it adjusts your frequency and your vibration to your body so that these extraterrestrial spiritual entities can find you and make contact. It's not a coincidence that they were all in the desert in California. And Orthon was traveling in a translucent metal scout ship, and then he began to communicate telepathically with Adamski that humanity was on the brink of nuclear war. And so again, they're always being communicated with telepathically because it has to do with the frequency and the vibration. This is why the New Age movement and the occultists are so obsessed with always messing around with things that adjust their frequency and vibration. This is a picture of him over here on the right holding the little UFO. In 1955 book Inside the Spaceships, Adamski claims that Orthon promised to take him on the ship to Venus to meet up with his late dead wife, Miss Adamski, who Orthon claims her spirit left her body when she died and she had been reincarnated on his home planet on Venus. So you can see the Eastern mysticism influences here of reincarnation. And, Adamski claims later that he never was able to hook up with Orthon and actually go and meet her. But that was one of the promises that this Venusian claimed. So he claimed that the Venusians were bringing a message of peace to Earth, and that other prominent humans throughout history had served as their messengers, including Jesus Christ, who was really an extraterrestrial entity who would be coming back at a later time when mankind needed them the most. So we're beginning to get a little taste of what this whole New Age occult philosophy is. They have to find a way to deal with that Bible, and so they've rewritten it. They're called Christian revisionists. They've revised the Bible and basically said that, you know what? All those old stories throughout the Bible, all those angels were really aliens. Jesus was really an alien, and they're all of this is about extraterrestrials. Once we get into the genetic portion of this, you're going to see that guys like Watson and Crick, who discovered, the alpha double helix in 1952, the same time when all these guys were getting into all this stuff, that they come up with a concept called directed panspermia, which is that the extraterrestrial entities placed their DNA on planet Earth millions of years ago, and then through the theory of evolution, that DNA became us, and now we're ready to evolve again to the next level. And just when we're on the brink of destruction in humanity, which we are today, of course, they're going to naturally, our predecessors who started us and planted us on the seed, our space mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, are going to show up at the exact right time, and they're going to save us and take us to this age of Aquarius, this golden age. And we're going to get into those doctrines much more deeply, but you can see how nefarious this entire thing is. And there's a lot of people who are believing it because, Christianity, let's face it, on a big level, it's fading out. People believe that is all just a bunch of religious dogma of yesteryear, and we need to get on with all of the new technology and the new ways of thinking. And so there's a lot of New Agers in the Christian church, make no mistake about it. So I just quickly pulled a couple of examples, but I really believe, based on all my research, that the true origin of the UFO thing really kicked off with Aleister Crowley, the Book of the Law, him bringing Lamb into our universe, and then Hubbard and Parsons and doing these satanic Babylon occult rituals where they're trying to incarnate the Babylon whore from the Book of Revelations. And they even admitted that they were trying to shatter the space-time, barrier and bring things in from the other side, and that they opened up a wormhole that they couldn't close, etc. And so that was really the trigger. But then in the 40s, in the early 50s, between the Roswell Incident and these three characters, Van Tassel, Bethlehem, and Adamski, you really see the UFO era. This is the breakout moment. And right away, you start to see in Hollywood, The Day the Earth Stood Still, 1951. The Thing from Another World, 1951. Van Tassel makes contact with Ashtar, 1952. Ron Hubbard starts Scientology, 1953. Kenneth Grant publishes his manifesto, 1955. Truman Bethlehem writing his books, 1954. George Adamski writing his books, 1953 to 55. So, the devil's in the details. Satan's really moving hard and fast. This is his time. He knows his time is short. and he's only got about 100 years to prep humanity. And so, you know, he really starts blasting humanity through television and through radio and through, you know, magazines and cartoons and just every which way he can, so that later down the road, this will just be common knowledge. You know, it's right now we have so many movies being produced about extraterrestrials and aliens and everything like that, that at some point it's not going to be a big stretch for mankind to receive some of this knowledge. And we're definitely getting close now to that time. So Van Tassel maintained that an entity named Salganda, which is an ascended master and has a lot in common with Sananda, who's another ascended master that Van Tassel discusses in some of his other writings. It's unclear whether they're the same two entities, but considering that Van Tassel's the one who subscribes to the fact that Jesus Christ was really an extraterrestrial ascended master, I believe that they have a lot of overlap. So here's some images of Sananda below. Now, if you do a search engine and put in Salganda, you're going to get this guy in the bottom left over here, who obviously looks a lot like Jesus. If you put in Sananda, you're going to get this guy down in the middle. And then if you put in Sananda Kumara, and the word Kumara is a Hindu word, then you're going to get this guy down here on the right. So there's a lot of different renditions of these tall, white Nordic beings. But Van Tassel long maintained that Salganda/Sananda were ascended masters who provided him with the formula for the Integratron during their exchange at Giant Rock in 1953. Over time, Van Tassel would assert that this formula was a 17-page equation tested secretly in Chicago, and that Salganda had verbally stated this far simpler version where he gave him this formula with F equals 1 over T for frequency and T for time. Conceptually, the Integratron was an amalgam of arcane interests, including mesmerism, also known as animal magnetism, which posits that there's an invisible natural force, possibly a vital bodily fluid, possessed by all living animate beings that responds to magnetism. The word mesmerize originated from Anton Mesmer, the 18th century founder of mesmerism, which was discounted by his peers as pseudoscience. So these entities belong to what's called the Council of Seven Lights. And basically what they're saying is what we've kind of already stumbled onto here over the last few lectures, that human beings are electromagnetic beings. We know that the universe is electromagnetic. We know the earth is electromagnetic. We know that the magnetic poles are affected by things like the moon. You know, this is how the moon can affect the tides and can affect a woman's menstrual cycle, for crying out loud. This whole universe is connected through electromagnetism, and that's how these entities are working through it. And it's not until we get into the 1900s that people begin to learn through science and some of the arcane, you know, mystery schools, guys like Crowley and Nikola Tesla and nuclear physicists like Jack Parsons, they begin to understand these higher level concepts of nuclear physics and quantum physics and electromagnetism. And so that's when things really take off. If you look here, over here on the Council of Seven Lights, you can kind of subtly see, here's your pyramid pointing up, and here's your pyramid pointing down. It's kind of that as above, so below vision that we see in all the mystery schools. The Council of Seven Lights has to do with the seven Pleiades, the seven planets of that star system, which is a true star system that's mentioned multiple times in the Bible. We're going to review that at a later time. But in the book of Job and several other places, God actually discusses some of the constellations, including Pleiades. Now, the Integratron is similar to a multi-wave oscillator, which is basically a combination of a high voltage Tesla coil along with a split ring resonator. And it generates ultra wideband electromagnetic frequencies across this planet, especially in California area. According to Van Tassel, the electromagnetic frequency of the Integratron resonates with and affects the biological cells, with every biological cell of a human being having its own resonant frequency. So this Integratron, this big white building, is resonating with EMF frequencies, which are having an impact on your biological cells. And he says that this apparently recharges the cell in much the same way that a battery can be charged. We've all seen someone take an electrical, piece of equipment, a battery charger, and hook it up to a battery and charge the battery. And so he claims that it would rejuvenate these human cells. And it also, he claims that it would open them up and allow them to be more telepathically charged, so that they have, that they can do guided meditation. So it has to be adjusting the frequency and the vibration of the person so that they're more in line with these occultists, with these mystery schools, and with these extraterrestrials. Additionally, George claimed that the Integratron was built at a location where there's an intersection of powerful geomagnetic forces that, when focused by the unique geometry of the building, they concentrate and amplify the Earth's magnetic field required for cell regeneration. There's no reason not to believe that. I mean, we know that there's an electromagnetic field around the planet, and that there are some areas where it's higher and lower. And so what he's saying here is that between the architecture of the building, between the technology of the Tesla coil and the split ring resonator, the location that they chose, which is a powerful geomagnetic area, you slap all this together, including the charged music inside, the crystals, the magnets, the whole 9 yards, and you're just making a massive, electromagnetic transmitter, if you will. It's just an electromagnetic transmitter on steroids. And, speaking about all this electromagnetism, this makes me reflect back on the electropsychometer of Scientology and the P meter that the Process Church was using. You begin to put some of this into perspective again and go, wow, those guys were kind of right on point with the rest of this, where they realized that it's all about electromagnetism to communicate with the spirit realm. And that's why, Ron Hubbard, everybody had to go into a room and walk through a ritual and hold on to an electric meter and allow energy and electricity and vibrations and frequencies to flow into their body. So amazingly, magnometer readings at the site of the Integratron showed a significant spike in the Earth's magnetic field at the center of the building, which is a 55-foot high and 38-foot wide diameter. It was believed that the giant rock was located along powerful ley lines. Now we're going to get into ley lines. Ley lines are the magnetic lines that run across the globe. There's different feelings about them. The New Agers, like this woman, Patty Wigington, claim that ley lines are believed to be, by many people, to be a series of metaphysical connections that link a number of sacred sites around the world. Essentially, these lines form some sort of grid or matrix and are composed of the Earth's natural energies. But then you have scientists who say, we can't you won't find ley lines discussed in geography or geology books because they aren't real, they're not actual, and they're not measurable things. Scientists can find no evidence of these ley lines. They cannot be detected by magnetometers or any other scientific device. So of course you're going to have people on both sides of the fence. But when you spend enough time looking at all the New Age mumbo jumbo, and you look at enough time looking at all of the sacred sites like the pyramids and things, I do believe that these ley lines are real. That's the conclusion that I've come to. And we'll get into that more in a moment. So here's an interesting article from a New Ager who talks about the chakras of the Earth and the ley lines. Now, we know that the New Agers and the Eastern mysticism are into the Kundalini serpent. It has the 7 chakras of the body, which are the neurological plexuses. But now, the New Agers talk about Earth. They refer to her as Mother Earth or Gaia. So Mother Earth is a living organism, and according to them, there's lots of ley lines throughout Mother Earth, and there's energy centers or chakras on Mother Earth. And so this is what this author has to say. Just like we have our own energy centers or chakras, Mother Earth has hers. When you start looking into the nature of the universe and the Earth, you'll start to see how everything's a mirror. Within us is a universe, and around us is a universe, and we're all connected. So she's talking about the macrocosm and the microcosm. In other words, some things that you see under the microscope have a lot of similarities as things that you see in a telescope. because God made everything and he used the same resources to make it. We are connected to Mother Earth through the subtle electrical current that runs around the entire planet. These electrical currents are known as ley lines and are almost like Mother Earth's veins. Just like we have veins that flow in and out of our heart, Mother Earth has ley lines, which are lines of energy that coil around the Earth in a similar fashion as a strand of DNA. In fact, where the ley lines intersect are believed to be the highest points of energy or high concentrations of electrical charge. These ley lines are also said to be able to take energy from these higher vibrational points and carry them around the world, spreading knowledge and wisdom to all inhabitants. Isn't that interesting? They're saying that these energy lines, which have vibrations and frequencies, are actually helping spread knowledge and wisdom to the people who go to these different areas. These intersecting points along the ley lines are also coincidentally home to some of the most sacred temples and monuments in the world, including the Egyptian pyramids, Machu Picchu, Stonehenge, and Angkor Wat. When you look into advanced civilizations like the ancient Egyptians, it is clear that they seem to understand the energy and the power of the ley lines. In fact, most ancient cultures around the world seem to have some understanding of these ley lines. In China, they're known as dragon lines. In South America, the shamans refer to them as spirit lines. And in Australia, the ancient Aborigines called them dream lines. And then in the Western world, we call them ley lines. What is also interesting to note is that where the ley lines intersect and meet, they also align perfectly with astrological constellations. If you think of these ley lines as Mother Earth's energy currents, you'll begin to see how it is possible that Mother Earth also has energy centers or chakras. So if you think about the human body with the central nervous system, with the brain and the spinal cord and the neurologic plexuses, they're kind of drawing a parallelism with Mother Earth in that it has also a central nervous system with its own neurologic plexuses where the energy is flowing to these different areas. So here's a couple areas where we see the ley lines cross, these energy lines. Here on the top left, you see Machu Picchu. It's an amazing structure in Peru. You know, it's the way they built it was pretty fascinating. It's high up in the mountains. Over here on the right, we see Stonehenge. And on the bottom right is also Stonehenge. And it's one of the oldest megalithic structures that have existed. They're pretty confident that this existed prior to the flood. And so it's also found on these ley lines. Here in the bottom middle, we see the Egyptian pyramids, which of course, you know, there's a lot of interesting information about them. There were millions of stones that were used. The nearest quarry was, 100 miles away. Supposedly pi 3.14 was discovered by Pythagoras, but the scientists say that they must have used that to form these perfect triangles years before Pythagoras. They claim that they had some kind of technology similar to a compass because these are placed at 0 degrees latitude and longitude within the center of its landmass. The apexes of these three pyramids line up with the 3 stars of Orion's belt and have astronomical significance. And so, again, there's high energy in terms of vibration and frequency, high electromagnetic energy at each one of these points. And it begs the question that maybe that's why these areas were chosen by the powers that be when these ancient structures were built. Now I'm going to go through this quickly, but they've actually documented some of the chakras around the planet. The root chakra is in Mount Shasta, California. The sacral chakra is Lake Titicaca in Peru, which is near Machu Picchu. The solar plexus chakra is in Australia. The heart chakra is Stonehenge in England. And the throat chakra is the Great Pyramid and all the way up to Jerusalem and Mount Sinai. And the third eye chakra They say here that the third eye chakra moves every 150 to 200 years. These eons are also lined up with astrological constellations, and it's believed that in 2012 we shifted into the age of Aquarius, which means that the third eye chakra is now currently located over Stonehenge. If you remember the year 2012, that's the year that supposedly the Mayan calendar talked about the end of the world, and everybody thought that that was the end, and nothing happened other than the fact that there was some shifting of the polars. The poles were starting to shift, and there's some electromagnetic changes that took place. So, but that was a prominent year to the New Agers. And this age of Aquarius, supposedly the previous time was the age of Pisces, and these people are all into the zodiac, so they look at the stars and the constellations, and the age of Aquarius is supposed to bring us into this new golden age where mankind evolves to the next level. I mean, this has gotten so sophisticated that these people have even drawn their own maps, and they've diagrammed where all the ley lines and the chakras are. So here's another map of the supposed ley lines. You can see it makes a grid across the whole planet. And where these come together now, for example, right here, notice this area on the map. This is over in the Superstitious Mountains where Arizona and New Mexico come together. Areas like Sedona. And we've had a lot of UFO stuff over there. They had the Phoenix Lights in the 90s. This is where a lot of the New Agers all come together. It's close to California, so that's a highly charged area. You can see over here is the Middle East. This is another area of a chakra. Now, there are also a lot of other areas that they claim have high energy from the ley lines. And these are some of these places: the Bermuda Triangle, the Devil Sea Triangle, Sedona, Arizona. Here in the bottom right, you can see a diagram where if you go straight across the map, you have both the Bermuda Triangle and the Devil Sea Triangle, where a lot of metaphysical and paranormal things have happened, with boats and ships and airplanes disappearing. Over here on the top right, you see these statues of these faces. This is on Easter Island, and these megalithic structures of all these heads have been there for millennia. On the bottom left, we see Sedona, Arizona, and some of the mountain ranges and the rocks. So this is an interesting article by a ufologist and New Ager, Mark Patrick Gibbons, who spent the last 20 years studying ufology. And it's about ley lines, and this is what he has to say. A ley line is a straight fault line in the Earth's tectonic plates. This is a scientific fact. What science, though, refuses to believe is that through these cracks in the Earth's tectonic plates, the magnetic energy released are very powerful indeed. In fact, many people have claimed to have felt the energy surge up their body, and some of them claim that they have blacked out as the surge was so powerful. Our ancestors have known about these lines for many hundreds of thousands of years. Every culture on the planet has known about these lines, yet everyone had different names for them. The Native Americans called them spirit lines, and their shamans used to use the electromagnetic energy in these lines to help them contact the spirits. They even designed their medicine wheel on the spirit lines, as they knew that these lines would follow a straight, round line. How did they know about these lines and the energies that they gave off? The sky gods told them. The eastern countries called them dragon lines, as the sky gods flew in dragons along these lines, and the Aboriginal people of Australia called these lines dream lines. Once again, they claim that knowledge was passed on to them from the sky gods. Now, I think that's very interesting. The first thing I want you to notice is that the Native American shamans used the electromagnetic energy in the ley lines to help contact the spirits. Once again, we're confirming electromagnetism is how you make contact with the spirit realm. That's why we see some of the things we saw in the past with electricity, electropsychometer. This is how the electricity gets into the central nervous system. It's all electromagnetism. Secondly, I think it's fascinating that all these ancient cultures believe that they learned all this esoteric information from the sky gods. That is not a coincidence. We already know that the Book of Enoch teaches that the fallen angels revealed all the secrets of heaven to mankind. They taught human beings everything from the winter and summer solstice, the movement of the moon and the sun, the clouds, astronomy, astrology, the zodiac, root cutting and herbs and medicines, metallurgy, weapon making, everything that we can, all of the major things of the past were revealed to mankind from these fallen angels. Now, of course, what the New Agers are going to say is that they weren't fallen angels, but they were extraterrestrials who were coming down here and revealing all that knowledge to us. And one of the things that they revealed are these ley lines. I also think it's interesting how they describe, the sky gods flying in their dragons, which we're going to get into that in a moment. The question you have to ask is, why would the fallen angels take the time to teach mankind about these electromagnetic ley lines? And the answer is that we're going to find out that all of the spiritual temples and the sacred monuments were built on these ley lines by humanity so that they could communicate with the spirit beings. And so it was a good investment, just like they taught mankind witchcraft and sorcery. Why do you think that they taught mankind how to use sacred geometry and how to do the rituals? And it's obvious, because it was through that mechanism that when mankind would do that, it would open up to higher dimensions and allow the spirit entities in. And so, same thing with these ley lines. If mankind knows where all these electromagnetic ley lines cross, and they build all of these ancient temples and sacred monuments there, and they show up there regularly like Stonehenge and do their, blood rituals, etc., then that's going to allow the demonic realm more power on this planet. The as above, so below. That the spirit realm is controlling everything here on Earth, but they have to have access to do that. And so there were two major investments that the Satan made. One was teaching mankind witchcraft and sorcery, and the other was teaching them where to put all of these ancient monolithic structures along these electromagnetic lines. Now, Mark Givens goes on to say that as I now enter my 21st year of researching the UFO paranormal phenomenon, for the past 15 of those years, I've started to notice how a lot of the phenomenon happens over areas that are saturated in ley lines. At first, I just thought it was all a coincidence. Then when I looked at the data we were collecting by interviewing witnesses to these events, as well as during my research, I read Maurice Cross's findings on the Enfield poltergeist and how he had found that 13 ley lines intersected the house. In his mind, that's why the family were experiencing the activity. I went back over all my cases with a fine-tooth comb, and 95% of the sightings and activity had all taken place on the ley lines. How can I prove this? Well, since being a young child, I've been able to dowse for ley lines. Now, dowsing is another spiritual situation where a person uses either metal rods or sticks, and they're able to find the electromagnetism of the earth, which can lead them to water, precious metals, ley lines, etc. It's considered by the occult to be the practice of divination. Aleister Crowley discussed dowsing. It's also called water witching, as being an occult practice that involves divination. So dowsing is a type of divination employed in attempts to locate groundwater, buried metals or ores, gemstones, oil, grave sites, and other objects and materials. Dowsing is considered a pseudoscience, and there's no scientific evidence that it is any more effective than random chance. And dowsers often achieve good results because random chance has a high probability of finding water. Dowsing has also been known as divining or doodlebugging, or water finding, or another word they used in the 1800s was water witching or water dowsing. They called it water witching because back in the 17 and 1800s, only the witches knew how to do it. You take a Y-shaped twig or rod, or two L-shaped ones, individually called dowsing rods, or divining rods, or vining rods, or witching rods, which are all sometimes used during dowsing. Although some dowsers use other equipment or no equipment at all, dowsing appears to have arisen in the context of Renaissance magic in Germany. This seems like a pretty wild thing, but I actually knew a guy once who claimed that he knew how to do this, and we went out into the desert of Texas, and he doused. This is before I knew anything about it. He used two sticks to find the place to put the well on his property, and they'd already drilled multiple holes on that land, couldn't find water, and this guy did water witching and found it. It's pretty wild, but it has to do with the electromagnetism, just like in this bottom picture here, where this guy's using a pendant right here. The electromagnetism has an impact on these, on the sticks and the rods and the pendants, and it helps show people where things are. Now, whether there's supernatural spiritual entities involved in it or not, I don't know, but they claim that occultists like Aleister Crowley claim that dowsing was a type of divination, and that the spirit of the python spirit of divination is what led you to the different things that you were searching for. Now again, when you study ancient cultures, they all referred to the sky gods or the star people who came down from the heavens and mated with their women, creating the hybrids. They also talk about where they received all this higher knowledge was from the sky gods, just as the book of Enoch reveals. And often they'll describe the sky gods coming down in what we would refer to today as some kind of vehicles or craft, but obviously they didn't have that kind of vernacular or vocabulary back then. So it's interesting when you look at some of the wording that they use. For example, the Native Americans claim that the star people came down in metal thunderbirds. And if you look down here, here's a diagram of a thunderbird, and you can almost see how it's got wings on it like an airplane. So it's a bird that flies. The Chinese describe the sky people traveling in fire-breathing dragons, because that was the adjectives that they used of that timeline. You know, there's a lot of depictions by the Greeks and the Romans of these chariots with fire coming out from behind and horses that are flying. All of the Vedics and the Eastern mysticism, they have some of their ancient books that describe something called flying vimanas. And they kind of look like this. They look like these kind of pyramid-shaped little buildings on electric carpets that have fire coming out of the bottom that they travel on. And even we see in the book of Ezekiel described the chariots of fire, which are wheels inside of wheels with fire coming out. And so there's going to be a lot of New Agers that say, see, the biblical record is really describing a UFO. And, you know, it's difficult to say whether it is or not. But the bottom line is just because there's UFOs doesn't mean that angels can't be using some kind of higher technology. In fact, that's all we see coming from the spirit realm is higher technology. It's clear when you study ancient religious texts that the demonic and fallen angelic realm use higher technology. Continuing on with what Mark Gibbons, the 20-year ufologist, said, he said that he went back and was going to do research over all the ley lines, and that he had been dowsing and being able to find those lines by dowsing for years. For my own peace of mind, I brought in a gifted psychic who I know and took them to the sites to see what they could pick up. Before I knew it, they had picked up several ley lines running through the area as they were in a trance-like state. I want you to think about that. This is a psychic medium who allows entities to come into him. This guy, Mark Gibbons, is an occultist. He's into all this stuff. He's friends with these psychics. He's a dowser, so he's already doused these lines. But then just to confirm it, he brings one of his gifted psychics in, and the gifted psychic starts to open themselves up through transcendental meditation and allow energy to flow through them. This puts them into a trance-like state, like guided meditation. And then they're able to feel this spiritual psychic energy and find these ley lines. So he says, before I knew it, they had picked up several ley lines. As they went into a trance-like state, they would point the lines out exactly where I had previously dowsed for them and found them. At no time did I tell them why we were going to the area. The only information I gave them was that several people had seen apparitions at the site. That's a ghost. We then went to 2 sites where UFOs had been observed. Once again, they were drawn towards the ley lines. With this independent psychic's findings, as at no time did I tell them what I was looking for, it confirmed what I was already beginning to suspect. Ley lines play an important part in what and why people were reporting UFO and paranormal events over these ley lines. So once again, this is just kind of building the credibility and authenticity in my mind that the spirit realm works through vibrations and frequencies and electromagnetism. Now, we've already demonstrated this time and time again through the past. You know, it's not a coincidence that Ron Hubbard's using the electropsychometer. It's not a coincidence that all the movies like Poltergeist show, these entities traveling through the electricity. It's not a coincidence that one of the symbols for Satan is lightning bolt, and Zeus. It's not a coincidence that the occult Russians developed all of the electronic music and used the electronic synthesizer to create the freaky music sounds. It's not a coincidence that Jonathan Dean, when listening to the Coil album, said that he was picking up on an electrical current, of a magical electrical current that gave him a Nikola Tesla moment where he thought he was communicating with, extraterrestrials. So this is these ley lines and this electromagnetic energy field that they used when they made the Integratron. This is all wrapped up into this New Age concept. Then in 1996, when I began my research into the abduction phenomena, I found the parallel between abductions and ley lines, as most abductees seem to live on or around heavy ley line sites. I began to look at my own abductions and contactee experiences. Now, one of the reasons why these abductees live on these ley line sites is they're just naturally attracted to it because they're all into the occult. It's not a coincidence that there's a bunch of New Agers who have moved to California, Arizona, New Mexico. I mean, if you remember a while back, we looked at an image of it showed the picture of a person on the front meditating, and they were trying to do guided meditation to contact their hybrid child. And it was a flyer where this woman was advertising how you could telepathically communicate with your hybrid. It's not a coincidence that she held that in Sedona. So these people are attracted to that area because their DNA and their frequencies are being tuned so that that's where they want to naturally gravitate. It's kind of like a magnet. They're being pulled in these areas. So this guy begins to look at all of his own abductions and contactee experiences, and he notices how all of them live on these heavy ley line sites. At this time, I was investigating the many UF sites over the Schmanden area of Huddersfield in West Yorkshire, as many people had reported seeing UFOs heading over to the area from Tolmolfen over to the Halifax area. This is all in England. As my database grew, I decided to map out all the UFO abductions and paranormal reports on a map and where the ley lines were, and I noticed how they formed a perfect equilateral triangle. By this time, my mind was made up strongly for the ley line link with the UFO abduction and paranormal phenomenon. All that was left for me to do was to find out why the phenomenon are drawn to areas saturated with ley lines. I checked all the sites and data that I had collected over the years. Then I rechecked. I noticed that 95% of the incidents that I had investigated happened where there's a heavy concentration of ley lines. I realized how every ancient culture had claimed that ley lines gave off positive or negative energy. Then I began to notice that a lot of the abductions by the Greys and a lot of the poltergeist activity were happening on ley lines that had been blacked by occult practices. I only found this out by going back to the drawing board and researching incidents which have been reported over the centuries, and as I did, I noticed how there were reports of witchcraft taking place on or around these sites. I even managed to track down some of the elderly people who had witnessed some of these events in the last century. So now we're getting somewhere. This guy is saying, look, I already know that there's a link between these electromagnetic ley lines on this planet and the UFO abductions and paranormal activity. But now the only thing left for me to figure out is why. Why is it happening there? And when he goes back and he looks through all of his data and all of the records of history, what he finds is these were areas where the grays and the abductions and the poltergeists and the ghosts. Notice these two things right here. One of them has to do with spiritual phenomenon, poltergeists. The others are gray aliens. See how they're kind of looking at them at the same thing? And that's because they are the same thing. They're all spiritual. And what he finds is that wherever there's abductions and poltergeist activity, it's where there's been occult practice and witchcraft. So the area has been charged supernaturally with spiritual energy. And that's where these entities manifest. And the reason I'm going through all this is, once again, I am trying to demonstrate time and time again that we're not dealing with little gray aliens who are traveling from 500 million light years away in their spaceships, and they're just out there in the universe, doing their thing simultaneously while we're doing our thing. No, instead, they're not intergalactic beings. It's interdimensional. These entities are coming from a higher realm or a higher dimension, and we're allowing them in, and they're really coming from the spirit realm. And all they are is demonic manifestations and fallen angels who are shape-shifting and masquerading as aliens as part of this last days delusion. Continuing on, Mark Gibbons says, "Then I remembered the Alan Godfrey abduction, which happened in Todmorden in 1980. The spot where he allegedly abducted was on a black line. It was one of the ley lines that ran from the woods of Cornholme, which is about 1.5 miles up the road from the spot that he was abducted. The evidence was just too strong for me to dismiss the ley line connection. I also found the opposite with the contactee side of the UFO phenomenon. I found that these experiences happen on ley line sites that were not blacked out, but the ones that gave off positive vibes, as my psychic friend put it, when they walked on positive ley line sites." So he's saying that there's two different types of ley lines. There's the negative charge ones, which they've blacked out on the map, and those are where the abductions happen and the poltergeist activity happen, and where there's been a lot of witchcraft and evil stuff. Then he says that there's positive charge ley lines, where a lot of the psychic energy is coming from, and people are not being abducted, but they're being contacted telepathically, and they're able to make contact. And so what we're going to find out throughout this process is, there's a lot of this good cop, bad cop stuff where some of the entities are good, like the Greys are bad and the Nordics are good. And there's even a bunch of New Agers that are saying that, some of the Nordics are going to come back and help deliver us from the bad extraterrestrials. And, it gets quite convoluted and quite complicated. So I found that these experiences happened on ley line sites that were not blacked out, and they gave off positive vibes, as my psychic friend put it when they walked on these lines. This was unlike where they began to feel pain and anger on the black lines. On one blackened line, they fell to the ground and lay unconscious for 10 minutes and refused to go back there until it had been cleansed. There are also less paranormal appreciations witnessed on positive ley lines. If there's been a violent incident on a ley line, it seems to be why appreciations are seen on positive lines. They seem to be replaying the events which occurred there. Ley lines do run on the Earth's tectonic plate fault lines. I have explained that ley lines give off positive and negative energy, the same as a magnet has a positive and negative pole. Ley lines run on the Earth's tectonic plates. The blacked or negative ley lines attract negative experiences, while apparitions and the blacked out or negative ley lines attract negative experiences as well as apparitions and alien abduction experiences. Due to the negative energy that the ley lines are emitting, it's the same as how negative people attract other negative people. This kind of has to do with the law of attraction, which is kind of a true concept. It's an occult concept, but we are charged like a magnet. We've already looked at that time and time again. Van Tassel even demonstrated that every cell has its own electromagnetic frequency. And so this is why like hang with like. This is why occultists are naturally drawn to other occultists. And this is why, born-again Christians are drawn to born-again Christians, and so on and so forth. So he's saying that due to the negative energy of these ley lines, it draws this negative attention and the negative people who are doing negative things there. I believe that they all feed each other. So the negative ley lines draw these things towards them so that they can feed off the negative energy. And as I said in some of the previous experiences, when you're walking in a lot of fear, the scripture says that God doesn't give you a spirit of fear, but of love, power, and a sound mind. When you have a tremendous amount of fear, that's affecting your vibration and your electromagnetic frequency of your body. And that's transmitting a special frequency that the demonic entity of fear enjoys. These demons, which are all around us, they can see these electromagnetic frequencies that we're emitting off of us, and then they're drawn to that. And so once they start hanging around you because you have so much fear in your life, all they need to do is wait until they see a sinful situation arise, and then that gives them the green light to enter into your vessel and take up shop and set up shop in your house. He goes on to say that I came to this conclusion as most people who have been abducted by the Greys claim that it was a negative experience in their life, as well as the experience on board the Greys spacecraft are always negative in nature. During my research, I found that around 95% of abductions with gray aliens happen where there are blacked out or negative ley lines. On the positive ley line sites, I found the opposite, that 95% of the incidences that happen on these sites are positive in nature. People who have spent time on these positive sites have had positive things happen in and around their lives. This is the last slide of this lecture, guys, and this is what the last thing that Mark had to say. Take the swastika, for example, on Ilkley Moor. Many of the people who have visited this stone have felt positive energy surge through their bodies. I know of a few people who've suffered with pain who walked up to the stone and stood on it, and they felt energy surge through their bodies, and a few hours later, their pain is rescinded and has not bothered them for a few months. I also know that this has baffled doctors as they suffered with arthritis. I even know mediums that go up there to charge their psychic batteries, so to speak. Once again, most of the contactee experiences happen where there are these positive ley lines, and I believe yet again that the positive energy released from them are attracting positive beings so that they can feed and recharge their positive energy. So up here on the top right is this ancient stone in Ilkley Moor, England, where someone carved a swastika in it. And they claim that it's at the intersection of ley lines and that people go there to receive positive energy that helps heal them. And this is why we see so many things in New Age healing, magnets and crystals and things which are supposed to help heal people. And there is some truth to it. On some level, it does help change your electromagnetic frequency and vibration. But the question again is what's the source of the healing? We have to take a strong look at that. Now, I find it interesting that he says, I even know mediums that would go up there and charge their psychic batteries. We already said that there's spiritual entities hanging around. And if you're a medium and you're inviting demons to come into your flesh, body, then obviously when you go in there, when you go to this swastika, where there's this electromagnetic ley lines, this is highly charged area, charged with a lot of energy. There's a lot of spiritual energy and entities there. And so naturally they're going to enter in and kind of tweak and dial in your DNA and your frequency. And we already talked about how the spirit of divination and many others can bring healing. One of the false counterfeits of the Holy Spirit is, the Reiki practitioner and the laying on of hands and the supernatural healing through this power of the universe, if you will, the chi or the prana. It's the same concept here. The only proof I have for this connection is from the painstaking and long years of research that I've done on this subject. Further proof comes from talking to the many witnesses to these phenomena, as well as the occurrences on the sites. Most paranormal, UFO, and Earth mysteries investigators say that there is no connection between ley lines and activity. All I can say in defense of my findings is that do as I did. Recheck all the data that you've gathered, and then collate it with known and unknown ley lines in the area. Then look into what has taken place on those sites and then look into your case files, you will find that all the negative reports and case happened on negative ley lines, and all the positive cases, such as contactee experiences, happened on positive ley lines. That's all what I did, and the evidence I dug up confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. Now, I believe, I follow what he's saying, and I believe that he's accurate in what he's saying. I think his interpretation is wrong. He just thinks that it's this powerful energy that's giving people good or bad, responses, and that it's, that he really believes that these are truly extraterrestrial entities. I believe that it's all that the planet does have electromagnetic lines running all through it, and that there are areas that are highly charged, powerfully charged demonically, and it's because all of these sacred temples have been put on them, and they've done all of these rituals, and they've done all this occult stuff, and so it continues to charge this area more and more and more. And then all these people who are into this stuff, they are like an antenna and a radio. They're just being drawn there naturally. They just think it's random happenstance that they want to go and do these things, but no, they're being called, they're being summoned. The spirit realm is drawing them in the same way that a magnet's going to draw something in. And then as they get closer, they begin to experience all these supernatural things, the paranormal stuff, and then and then the entities eventually come in and connect with them, and the fallen angels and the demonic realm are now controlling these people and inspiring them to do these different things and learn these different things, and so on and so forth. So it's like this negative feedback loop where the electromagnetic energy coming from these demonically charged areas draws in the person, and then when the person gets drawn in, that tunes in their DNA to be more in line with them, and then that just feeds into the demonic entities, and then that just continues to work on their DNA. It's a negative feedback loop that just keeps going around in a circle. So that's it for today, guys. It's a pretty wild, lecture on all this electromagnetism, vibrations, and frequencies. The next lecture, we're finally going to get into some real meat and potatoes when it comes to scripture. We're going to go into the Ashtar Command, which is basically what the last day's deception is. The last day's deception, as you're going to see on the next lecture, is that all of these entities that are being communicated with, these Nordics and the Greys, that they're going to show up at the right time, and they're going to help humanity evolve to the next level, or what they refer to as the ascension. And we're going to get into how they say Jesus is one of them, and we're going to talk about some specific verses and try and really paint a picture of what's coming down the pike. So on that note, we'll call it quits. May the Lord bless each one of you, and we'll see you on the next one.